Hi, this is Leah Jerling. I'm here to give my presentation for Ed Law, MSL 5060 through Baker University with Professor Brett Becker. Today's date is October 14th, 2018. The title of my presentation is Freedom of Speech in Schools. So, freedom of speech comes from the First Amendment. The First Amendment is part of the Bill of Rights. It's the very first Bill of Rights. First part of the Bill of Rights, and it was created in 1789. The First Amendment is made up of 5 different freedoms: freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of petition, and freedom of press. The focus of this presentation is freedom of speech. So the cases that I will be covering today are Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District from 1969. This case revolved around the incident where students were wearing black armbands protesting the Vietnam War and were suspended from school. Hazelwood versus Kohlmeyer in 1983. This was around the school newspaper called The Spectrum. The principal decided to eliminate some articles, deeming them inappropriate for the school paper. The next case is Bethel School District number 403 versus Frazier in 1986. This was about Matthew Frazier, who was giving a speech for a friend who he was nominating in the school elections, and the school district deemed his speech to have some inappropriate content. And then the last one is a more recent case. Some of you may have heard of it in current events. Easton Area School District versus BH. This was in 2013, and it revolved around the case of the boobies bracelets. I know that sounds inappropriate, but we'll get into that later on. So Tinker versus Des Moines, I know we are all very familiar with this case. We keep going back to it in a lot of different issues discussed in this class. But just in case you forgot what it was about, students wore black armbands to school in protest of the Vietnam War. There were 2 siblings, Mary Beth and John Tinker. Both of their last name was Tinker, and they kept wearing these black armbands to school. The school suspended them so that they could not go back to, and said that they could not go back to school until they agreed to stop wearing them. There was this court case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. The ruling was that students are not stripped of their rights at school as long as the incident does not interrupt the educational environment. And in this case, the black armbands, just wearing them, was not causing a disruption. It was a very silent and peaceful protest. This case is so important. It is used in lots of different freedom of speech cases, and it was used in all the cases that I studied for this presentation and for my paper. The next one is Hazelwood versus Kohlmeyer, 1983. And so at the Hazelwood East High School, there was a newspaper called The Spectrum. It was the school newspaper. It was created by students, but it was sanctioned by the school. The principal read the paper before it was published, just to kind of preview it, and he thought that certain articles were inappropriate and removed those articles. This became a freedom of speech issue, and this case moved up through the Supreme Court. The main question involved in this case was the principal stripping students of rights by removing the articles? In the case description, it says that the court held that schools must be able to set high standards for student speech disseminated under their auspices, and that schools can retain the right to refuse to sponsor speech that was inconsistent with the shared values of a civilized social order. Since this was a school-issued newspaper, school-sponsored newspaper, the principal did have the right to remove those articles if it did not meet the high standards that the school had. So if this were a student-created newspaper and not sponsored by the school, it would have been a different ruling. The next one is Bethel School District number 403 versus Frazier, 1986. Matthew Frazier was a student at Bethel High School. He made a speech nominating one of his friends for elective office. There were 600 students in the auditorium when he was making this speech. The speech contained a sexual metaphor for his friend, which the school thought was too graphic for the school, because this was a school-sanctioned event. Frazier was suspended and took the case to court. The case posed the question, does the First Amendment prevent a school district from disciplining a high school student for giving a lewd speech at a high school assembly? The ruling was in favor of the school, saying that lewd speech can disrupt the learning environment. So it did go back to Tinker. Remember, Tinker states that students do have their rights, especially the right to free speech. But in this case, his free speech was taken away because it did disrupt the learning environment. And this was a very important case, which will be used in my next case as well. So this is a more modern case. It's Easton Area School District versus BH. BH was the initials of one of the girls involved in this. She was a minor. It was in 2013. So this took place at a middle school. This was during Breast Cancer Awareness Month, which is the month of October. Middle school students at this school wore bracelets. If you remember, like the rubber bracelets, like the Livestrong bracelets, they were those kind of bracelets that said "I heart boobies" and in parentheses said "Save a breast." So these were worn to promote breast cancer awareness. And the school stated that students were not allowed to wear these. So once they were wearing them, the school said that they were not allowed to wear them anymore, but they could show awareness in other ways. BH and KM were the initials of the two students who continued to wear these, and they were suspended. So the issue here was freedom of speech and inappropriate speech. So these came from both the Tinker and the Bethel case, which I discussed earlier. Remember, Bethel versus Frazier was where the guy made a speech at school and it had some inappropriate content. So this case kind of went back to both of those cases. This case did not make it to the Supreme Court. Some argue that because it was a freedom of speech issue and because it was talking about boobies, the school district did not want it to be very public. So they tried to keep it contained in the lower courts. They did use Tinker and Bethel to make the ruling. They decided that there was no disruption in school from these bracelets, in that boobies is an inappropriate word, especially at the middle school level when it's just used by itself. But within the context of being part of the Breast Cancer Awareness Month, it was appropriate for this. So it just kind of, they have to look at the degree of the inappropriateness of the speech and then what context it's being used in. The implications of administrators for freedom of speech issues, making sure that administrators always look at their board policies. Some board policies are more specific where others are a little more vague. So making sure that you're following whatever there is there and contacting people that can help you kind of navigate some of those board policies. Definitely use the cases from the past, like some of the ones I've discussed here, and there's many more out there as a base for your decision making. Some questions to ask is, what is the board policy? Am I inhibiting the student's rights? And is the student's act interfering with the educational environment? So that is my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.